Episode 7. Leave Me Alone. Tom was breathing heavily. Cheryl stood to the side and gave her father an insincere pat on the chest to calm him down. Dad, calm down. Don't get angry with her. Now that she is back, it won't be good for you to kick her out again. Besides, the child is innocent, and he's your grandson. She purposely emphasized the word grandson because she knew this would make Tom even angrier. Nick stood to the side and watched the chaotic reunion of the Davidson family. He stared at the black-eyed child hiding behind Natalie's back and suddenly remembered the man who had appeared beside her yesterday. He clenched his fists as the coldness in his heart grew. His emotions seemed to be on the verge of overflowing. After all, he and Natalie had been together for several years, and although their relationship had ended because of what had happened, he still couldn't help the fact that she had held a place in his heart. Natalie was expressionless as she looked at her family. The bitterness in her chest bubbled up, but she forced it back down. She had thought her father might react like this, but when she saw it in person, she couldn't help but feel pain. No one knew what it had been like for her to be exiled abroad. She had been so poor before Liam was born that she sometimes had no money to eat and nowhere to sleep. She had eaten only one meal a day in order to save. She had suffered all sorts of hardships and been the victim of all sorts of crimes. But even though she had nearly starved to death in the streets, no one had called her to ask if she was doing okay. She had worked hard to reach the point where she was financially stable, but in all these years where she experienced both hardships and rose up as a fighter, she had stopped caring what other people thought of her. Now, she did not care what her father thought. Liam is my son. She let out a heavy breath, burying her memories of the past. I don't care whether you accept him or not. I've only come back to attend the engagement party. As soon as it's over, I'll leave. Tom stared at her disdainfully. You can come to the party, but you definitely can't bring your child. Just because you don't mind being shameless doesn't mean we're cool with you embarrassing the family. Natalie did not care about bringing Liam to the party. She had no feelings about all this but disgust. So she casually agreed, and then turned around and left with Liam. She didn't even go into the living room, and she left the home that she had lived in for 20 years without a shred of nostalgia. She lowered her head and looked at her watch. It was still early, so she decided to return to her grandma's house and take advantage of this rare opportunity to pick up some things for the old woman on the way. She was about to hail a cab at the intersection when Nick followed her and stopped in front of her. Is there something else? She crossed her arms with an expression that showed she didn't want to talk to him anymore. When he saw her, Nick felt angry again. She was clearly in the wrong for fooling around with other men, and now she had the nerve to talk to him like this? I want to ask you. His voice was uncontrollably sullen as he stared straight into her eyes. What exactly did you mean when you called Cheryl disgusting yesterday? She hadn't thought he would remember the words she had used in anger. She was stunned for a moment before she indifferently raised her head to look at him. What right do you have to say something like that to her? When she didn't respond, he clenched his fists and shouted, You're the disgusting one. You betrayed me back then and played around with another man. Now you have the nerve to. Have you finished? She didn't wait for him to stop talking, but frowned and cut him off. You don't deserve to talk about what happened back then, Nick. We grew up together, and after knowing each other for so long, you didn't even give me 1 ounce of trust. When she spoke, she became so enraged that her chest felt tight. The man she had thought she loved, the one she had been willing to spend the rest of her life with, had chosen to leave when she needed him the most. I was set up, and you left without asking a single question. Now we're even. We don't owe each other anything. You can go right ahead. I won't stop you from living your life with a woman like Cheryl. With that, she turned her back on Nick, bent over to take Liam's hand, and prepared to leave. At that moment, Nick realized that there was something strange about what she was saying. He reached out to grab her wrist and asked anxiously, "What do you mean you were set up?" Cheryl, who was hiding nearby and listening to their conversation, couldn't hold back anymore. She quickly walked over to them, grabbed Nick's waist, and said coquettishly, "Nick, why did you come out here? Why don't you come back with me?" She couldn't completely hide the panic on her face. It was obvious that she wanted to stop Natalie from speaking the truth. Natalie glanced at her and laughed inwardly. "You showed up just in time." Hearing her disdain, Nick immediately became defensive. "It's odd that you were saying all this. Is it because you want to make Cheryl look bad?" She looked at him, wondering what kind of spell Cheryl had put on him to make him like this. "If you're so protective of her, why are you still following me? You two are living your lives, so just leave me alone." Natalie couldn't bear to listen to their nonsense any longer. She spit out her words and left with Liam. Episode 8. The Engagement Party. After the heated exchange, Natalie did not have any contact with her family for almost a week. Then, in the blink of an eye, the day of the engagement party arrived. Not only were they celebrating the couple, but also the joining of the Davidson and Barnard families. They were two powerful families in Seattle, and so a lot of well-known political and business figures were coming. Tom stood at the door of the party hall to greet the guests. Seeing that it was nearly time, he called Nick over to talk to him. "Cheryl and her mother have suffered a lot in the past," he sighed and said earnestly. "Now that you two are engaged, you mustn't disappoint me. If you treat her badly, I won't let you off easily." Nick nodded his head seriously. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of her and never upset her, not in the slightest." Satisfied, Tom patted his shoulder. But then, as if he had just thought of something, he turned around and looked toward the door. "That woman will be coming today, right?" "Of course. I hope she doesn't cause any trouble." A trace of annoyance immediately surfaced on his face. "It was difficult for us to get Mr. Walker to attend, so we can't let anything go wrong. You have to ensure that everything goes off without a hitch." Mr. Walker was a very powerful man, and most of the people from the business community attending today were keen to meet him. If they could take advantage of this opportunity to get even a tiny bit closer to him, the Davidsons and the Barnards would be in a much better position in the future. While the two of them were talking, Cheryl finished dressing and walked leisurely down the stairs. She was wearing a long, plain, champagne-colored dress that made her skin appear as white as freshly fallen snow, and her curly brown hair was pulled into a bun at the side, revealing her long white neck. Her appearance caused quite a stir. All the guests nodded their heads in praise of her beauty. Cheryl was overjoyed, and she walked up to Nick and hooked her arm through his. Tom watched the two of them and sighed with emotion. "I'm handing my precious daughter over to you. You must look after her for me." Nick stretched out his hand and took hold of Cheryl's. He smiled at her, and then turned back to Tom and solemnly promised, "I will live up to your expectations." When the nearby guests saw this, they were filled with praise. "Oh, they are such a wonderful couple. A talented man and a talented woman. It makes me so happy." Just then, someone raised their voice. "Don't you have another daughter, Tom? How come I haven't seen her for a while? If I remember correctly, this man was her fiancé once, right?" The words were like a bomb. The entire hall erupted into commotion. Those who knew the story lowered their voices and said, "How could she ever have had the nerve to show her face? I heard she did something so shameful that they secretly sent her abroad. I don't even know whether she's back or not." "Who knows?" Someone immediately retorted. "Wasn't Tom's wife also a mistress? Maybe the apple doesn't fall far from the tree and Cheryl actually stole her sister's fiancé." There were many different opinions among the crowd. Tom's face became gloomy listening to the words that were circulating. This was Cheryl's engagement party, not an opportunity to dig into her past and gossip. How could he tolerate that other woman becoming the focus of attention? He was looking around the hall in annoyance when he saw Natalie walk in with Liam. Although she hadn't shown her face in this circle for 5 years, her brilliance was still the same. Whether it was her appearance or her aura, she still had the grace and beauty that people remembered from back then. But she seemed to have matured a lot. Her arrogance had become more restrained, creating an even more striking impression. "Look, I told you she was extraordinary. Her personality alone is enough to make people jealous." The guest who had said that he thought Cheryl wasn't inferior to Natalie immediately lowered his head in shame. Tom's expression turned cold. He walked up to Natalie and lowered his voice, trying his best to control his voice. "What's wrong with you? Didn't I say that you couldn't bring the child?" He felt that she was purposely going against his wishes and trying to make a scene at Cheryl's engagement party. He pointed towards the door, his expression furious, and he didn't hold back his emotions. "Get someone to take him away or I'll kick him out." Tom's dismissive attitude to Liam was like a needle that pierced Natalie's heart. "If that's the case." She stood tall and looked at the child in her arms. "Why did you make me travel all the way here? You knew it would make you unhappy." "Don't worry, I'll leave with him right now." Seeing that she was about to leave, Cheryl became anxious. She quickly forced a smile and said, "Natalie, don't leave. Daddy was just being impulsive. He hasn't forgotten about you once in the past 5 years." With one hand holding on to Tom and the other holding her fiancé, she tilted her head and smiled. "Don't be angry. Today is my engagement party. I really want your blessing." Looking at her, Natalie couldn't help but sneer. Cheryl's silent boasting was much more powerful than her dignified words. She wanted to show off how good her life was, to prove that she had stolen her place in the Davidson family. Natalie saw all this and ignored her. She turned to look at her father, who was still upset. "What? Do you want me to stay?" Tom looked at her and saw that her eyes were full of hurt. He waved his hand impatiently and said in a harsh tone, "Go and stand to the side. Don't wander around in front of us." She wasn't in the mood to argue with him, so she took Liam's hand and found a corner to sit down in. Although the hall was bustling with noise and excitement, Natalie felt tired. 5 years ago, she had been cruelly exiled, and now she was back, with no choice but to attend Nick and Cheryl's engagement party. She didn't know what Tom was thinking. The more she thought about it, the more her head started to ache. Her old illness had returned, and she had not been able to shake it off for the past 2 days. The pressure of everything mixed together, and she held onto her forehead in pain. "Mommy?" Liam noticed her discomfort. He held onto the armrest of the chair and asked, "Are you okay?" Without waiting for her to speak, he ran to a waiter and asked for a cup of water in a childish voice. The waiter looked at this obedient and sensible little boy and was struck by how cute he was. He agreed and returned with a cup of water. After drinking half of it, Natalie felt slightly better. She rubbed her temples, finally managing to calm down. And when she looked up, she saw Tom and an older man walking towards her. Episode 9. False Family. Tom came closer and introduced the man beside him. "Mr. Walker, this is my eldest daughter, Natalie." James Walker looked at her. With his hands behind his back, he laughed until wrinkles appeared at the corners of his eyes. "Mr. Davidson, you are so lucky. Both of your daughters are beautiful. I'm envious. You're too kind." On the other side of the room, Cheryl overheard Mr. Walker and quickly pulled Nick aside. "I'm not as beautiful as Natalie. I know I can't be compared to her." Natalie looked at her father's expression, which was now as calm as a spring breeze, and got a bad feeling in her stomach. She could tell that he was up to no good. "I only have 2 daughters," Tom coughed. "Now that my youngest has found happiness, it's time to worry about her sister's future." He turned and nodded to Natalie. "Natalie, talk to Mr. Walker, please." His fatherly expression made her feel nauseous. She finally understood why he had made her come back. It was because he wanted to introduce her to this man, this fat, greasy man who he obviously was trying to reel in. Seeing him in the same room as Nick made him look even worse. Until now, she had still had a sliver of hope that Tom might have called her back because he wanted to make up for what he had done to her. But now it seemed that was just wishful thinking. Tom had never felt that he owed her anything, and he had obviously never felt ashamed. Just then, a tall, powerful figure stepped into the hall and quickly became the focus of everyone's attention. But Natalie was still immersed in her own world and did not notice. "Sorry, I don't think I have anything to talk about with Mr. Walker," she smiled coldly. "I came to the party, just like I said I would. If there's nothing else, then I'll be leaving." As she spoke, she put down the cup in her hand and got up to leave. "Natalie!" Cheryl let go of Nick's hand and came over to her father, pretending to be friendly. She reached out and grabbed Natalie's wrist. "Don't be angry. Daddy did this for your own good. All these years he's been worrying about your future." She almost managed to squeeze a tear from the corner of her eye. "Mr. Walker is the head of the Walker Group, and he is also a real estate tycoon. If you stay with him, you'll definitely live a life of luxury and ease." She said a lot of things, but Natalie remained unmoved. She raised her hand to shake off her sister's words with a frown. "You make him sound like a catch. Why don't you marry him?" "What are you saying?" Cheryl immediately bit her lip. "I already have Nick. How could I marry anyone else?" "Natalie," Tom snapped when he heard. "How can you say that?" Her stepmother, Rosemary, had come over and was frowning as well. With an expression filled with heartache, she said, "Cheryl respects you so much, and you speak to her like this." "Respect?" She felt like laughing. "You use words like that to deceive ignorant people, not me. Don't expect me to play along with it. Don't insult me." They were so absorbed in their conversation that none of them noticed that behind them, a tall figure had raised his head and caught sight of her. "Mr. Walker, you don't know the whole story." Natalie crossed her arms and turned to look at him. "Although I am the eldest daughter of this family, I've been exiled abroad for 5 years. My status in this family is somewhere below the maids. You won't get even the slightest benefit from me. So you might as well choose my younger sister. She's been spoiled and doted on all her life, unlike me. I also have a child, and everyone in Seattle knows about it. If you marry me, you'll only be insulting yourself." Natalie's words were decisive because she didn't have as many scruples as Tom. Since she wanted to cut off this relationship, why not do it cleanly? The moment she finished speaking, everyone's expressions changed. Tom and Rosemary's faces were filled with fear and awkwardness from having their lies exposed. The gathered guests all started to feel sorry for Natalie. "Huh, I didn't know they treated her like that. How could he do that? After all, she's his daughter, his own flesh and blood. As a father, how could he be so heartless?" "Mr. Davidson." Mr. Walker couldn't hold in his anger any longer. He looked at Tom and said with a forced smile, "You didn't tell me she had a child." "How could I possibly lie to you, Mr. Walker?" Tom was so anxious that he wanted to explain, but the truth had already come out. No matter what he tried now, it would be useless. Natalie had sacrificed her reputation to hurt him even more. There was no way out of it. Just as his scalp started to burn from worry, he suddenly heard a cold sneer behind him. "When did the woman I've got my eye on become reduced to this? To being sold like a cheap toy?" Everyone turned their attention to the person who had spoken. They saw a man walking over with steady steps. There was a playful smile on his face, and his eyes stared at Natalie like she was his prey. Enemies are always easy to find. He hadn't expected to meet this woman here. Episode 10. The Man Really Knows How to Hold a Grudge. When Natalie saw him, she was so shocked that her lips parted slightly, and she didn't know what to say. She hadn't thought that she would meet this man again so soon. It was fate. Tonight he was wearing a tailored suit that fitted him perfectly. His stature was tall and straight, and his entire body emitted an indescribable aura that filled those around him with awe. While everyone was whispering and trying to guess who he was, Mr. Walker's face changed dramatically. He rushed forward and shouted, "Mr. Clare, I never expected to meet you here." Tom couldn't believe his ears. So this was Bryce Clare, The man who had control of the city's economy and who could shake up financial circles with the snap of his fingers. He hadn't expected him to be so young. Cheryl pulled Nick aside with an ugly expression on her face. She said in a low voice, "What's going on? Isn't that the man who picked Natalie up at the airport the other day?" As soon as she said it, as if trying to prove her right, Liam, who had been standing in the corner, excitedly ran over to Bryce and hugged his calves. "Daddy, you're here!" he shouted. Natalie was so embarrassed that she wanted to cover her face and run away. The argument in the car that day was still vivid in her mind. She didn't want to owe this man anything. "Daddy?" Tom felt like he had been struck by lightning when he heard this. He stood there in a daze, then turned around and asked Natalie, "Is he Bryce Clare's son?" She didn't know how to answer, so she just pursed her lips slightly and turned to look at Bryce. Bryce bent down without hesitation and hugged Liam. Then he caressed Natalie's face and laughed softly. "Didn't you say we would come here together? How come you left without waiting for me?" The fingers that touched her cheek burned like fire. Her face flushed red as she tried to turn away. For a moment, she was unable to say a word. Bryce didn't care about her reaction. He just glanced at Mr. Walker, who was no longer calm. He was frightened by the man's gaze and quickly apologized. "I didn't know Miss Davidson was with you. I'll leave." Mr. Walker spoke quickly, and then without waiting for Tom to say anything, turned and left the hall. Tom could only stand there helpless. He railed against Natalie in his heart. How could she hide her relationship with Bryce from her family? He was about to say something, but Bryce interrupted him. Holding the child in one hand and Natalie's shoulder in the other, he said, "Come on, let's go sit over there for a while." With that, he left Tom and took the other two with him. When they reached a quiet corner where nobody was paying attention to them, Natalie finally broke free from his arm. She retreated half a step and asked doubtfully, "Why did you help me?" "Of course I didn't want to help you," Bryce sneered. He grabbed her wrist and whispered into her ear, "You're an ungrateful little thing. I'm here to get even." When he spoke, he intentionally leaned in very close to her ear, his breathing heavy. She knew that he was talking about the $100 she had thrown at him, and she felt uncomfortable and backed away slightly. She hadn't expected this man to hold a grudge, so just helping her required him to settle the score. After a while, she reached for Liam and snatched him back. She pulled him away from Bryce and looked at him cautiously. Seeing her black eyes looking at the boy like she had to protect him, Bryce couldn't help but laugh. He leaned in again and whispered into her ear, "Don't be nervous. People I want never get away. Just be good and wait for me here." After he said this, he turned and walked away, leaving her with the child in her arms and her heart beating erratically. Her cheeks burned. She hadn't felt like this in years. Episode 11. Why would she want any other man? "Mommy?" Liam looked at Bryce's departing back and whispered, "Where is Daddy going?" Natalie touched his head. She felt conflicted. He seemed certain that this man was his father, and no matter what she said, she couldn't change his mind. She smiled helplessly and was about to remind him again that that wasn't his dad. But when she raised her head, she saw Cheryl walking slowly toward her. "What are you doing here?" Her expression immediately darkened, and she spoke with a tone that was not cold, but also could not be described as indifferent. Cheryl immediately played innocent and lightly tugged her arm. "I don't need a reason. I was just afraid that my sister was bored, and so I came over to chat." Why was she suddenly acting so kind? She'd been angry just now, and now she was trying to provoke her. "Natalie, you don't know this, but I actually used to envy you." Seeing that Natalie wasn't paying attention to her, Cheryl pouted and continued sadly, "Ever since I was young, Dad was always with you, while Mom and I lived in that rented apartment. I was really envious of you. I even wanted to snatch Dad and Nick away from you." Natalie found it funny that she spoke as if she had been wronged, but didn't know who was responsible for it. "But, you know, big sis," Cheryl choked, and her voice filled with sobs. "Nick was really loyal to you." He only wanted to be with you, which is why I made you hurt me. So that I could get his attention, so that he would care for me. In the first year after you went abroad, he was in turmoil. But by helping him through the most difficult days of his life and letting him see my strengths, he slowly started to develop feelings for me. Have you finished? Just as Cheryl was getting started, Natalie, who remained expressionless, interrupted her. I'm not interested in listening to your emotional story, nor do I have time to watch you brag. Why? She immediately put on a sad expression and then laughed out loud. You're not holding yourself back anymore. Well, it's true. You've always been like this. That's what I like about you most. Otherwise, 5 years ago, you wouldn't have played into my hands like a fool. Do you think you can become a queen bee just by hooking up with Bryce Clare? He doesn't know about your past, does he? Cheryl had a face full of mischief. She tapped her chin with her finger and casually picked up a glass of wine from a server beside her. If he knew that you still had feelings for your little sister's fiancé, how would he react? She thrust the wine into Natalie's hands and pushed her away with a frown. Then she smirked and threw herself to the ground. With her hair in a mess around her head, she cried, Sister, you already have Bryce. Why are you still thinking about Nick? She purposely raised her voice to attract the attention of all the guests in the hall. Do you still blame me for getting together with him? She bit her lips as tears threatened to fall from her eyes. But he caught you cheating. You broke his heart first. How can you still? She did not finish her sentence, but she had already said enough to put all the blame on Natalie. The surrounding guests looked at the stunned Natalie, who felt her head buzzing and her temples throbbing. Seeing Cheryl kneeling on the ground in a very sorry state, Nick squeezed through the crowd, pulled her into his arms, and roared fiercely, Natalie, why are you like this? Even Tom leaned towards her and reprimanded her. How could I have a daughter with such a vicious heart? The endless scolding made her head spin. She put Liam down, afraid that she would drop him.
You nasty woman!
Liam shouted at Cheryl, who was still on the ground.
You're lying!
Natalie felt unbearable pain in her chest. She tried her best to support herself, but her vision went dark again. Losing her balance, she fell backward. But instead of hitting the cold tiled floor, she fell into a warm embrace. Bryce caught her tightly in his arms and looked up at Cheryl with a cold gaze as she was helped to her feet. Seeing his stare, Cheryl panicked and started to act pitifully. With a weak voice, she said, Mr. Clare, don't blame me. My sister grew up with Nick after all. They grew up together. Bryce sneered and turned to look at Nick with a hint of ridicule in his voice, still talking to Cheryl. Your sister had a bad taste in the past, but that's over now. With me here, why would she want any other man? He did not react to Cheryl's stupefied expression. Instead, he picked up Liam with one arm and hugged the unconscious Natalie close to him before turning around and leaving.